Welcome to Bay Area Psychology. Tonight we turn our focus to adult children and siblings of the mentally ill. What if you grew up with a parent or sibling who was unpredictable, angry, or withdrawn for days at a time? What if they were hospitalized periodically? What if you brought a friend home to have them confronted by your sister who was having a bad day and who began telling your friend about the transistor implanted in her? What if your parent or sibling refuses help? We are joined tonight by Los Altos therapist Laura King, a specialist in providing counseling and support groups for adult siblings and children of the mentally ill. Laura, I want to welcome you.
Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you for making time to join us tonight. This is, I think, a very interesting subject. I think it's something that doesn't get talked about a lot. I know particularly in the last few years or so, probably 10 years, there's really been a focus on adult children of alcoholics and looking at that as a primary trigger. But I don't think enough attention has been paid to what it's like to live with somebody who has a, I would guess, undiagnosed or untreated or even treated mental disorder. How did you get interested in this particular specialty?
Well, the way that I became interested was that I was a sibling myself. As an adolescent, I had a sister who became mentally ill. So I'm well acquainted with what it is like to have someone in the family who develops a mental illness and the chaos that comes around that.
Okay. And at that time, how old an adolescent were you?
I was an early teen.
Early teen, okay. So that must have been very confusing to you.
Right. There's a lot of confusion that happens when a sibling especially becomes mentally ill. There are a lot of unknowns. There are a lot of, what's happening. You don't understand the behavior. Often your parents are not good resources for answers because they don't understand what's happening either.
Right.
Because there's so much coming at you at one time, there's so many different behaviors, there's so much fear that you feel. Your sibling is acting in ways that they've never acted before.
Right.
Maybe now they're calling you not your sister, but maybe they're saying that you're a bad person, you're the wicked sister, So there are just a lot of changes that you have to deal with.
Sure, I'm sure it's difficult trying to understand causation, particularly if, like some mental illnesses I know develop gradually over time, and others tend to be more abrupt in the way they occur. Let's take a look at some of the issues that people in this situation deal with. You can explain them to us. Let's see. We have pain. We have mental illness leaves what you called a path of pain, unresolved grief issues, fears of mental illness yourself. I would imagine that as a sibling that would come up. Effects of emotional choices, guilt, lowered self-esteem, interrupted normal development, and then recurring patterns in relationships. And I have those in front of me, so let's go ahead and take a look. In terms of path of pain, what's that in reference to?
Well, what happens when someone, a sibling or a parent becomes mentally ill, there's a tremendous amount of pain that the well siblings feel. It can be around the grief experienced, it can be around the losses that are experienced. For example, there's a tremendous amount of pain that occurs. Say, if at one time you were a healthy adolescent and you could go out into the world and have your friends over, you could do the activities you enjoyed, and then once your sibling becomes mentally ill, there's sort of this message that comes at you to not have people over. So there's a loss of friendships there, which causes a tremendous amount of pain. There's a pain of losing your sibling, that sibling that you once knew. Now that this person looks like your sibling, but they don't act like your sibling. Right. So it's almost as if there's a death, but there's not a death.
Yeah. I would imagine that would create kind of an odd resolution or kind of a void. Also here in terms of fears of mental illness, I have here a quote that says, every well sibling we've interviewed has at one time or another feared the possibility of becoming like a seriously disturbed sister or brother.
That's true. What I found, and of course what many siblings find, is that they're looking at age markers. Oh, well, my sibling became ill at the age of 17, so if I can just make it to the age of 17, I'll be okay. And then sometimes that age becomes higher and higher. And, you know, I think what really helps there is education, you know, and knowing that, well, just because your sibling became mentally ill does not mean in any way that you will be.
Okay. I imagine that's also true of parents. I mean,
Sure.
I'm sure the same thing would operate. In terms of effects of emotional choices, it sounds like that part of this is coping with it. You know, what the kind of choices you make and how you're going to cope with this change in your family.
Well, what happens when someone in the family becomes mentally ill is that you immediately are called upon to make choices in how you're going to cope. And the natural sort of tendency in these families is to withdraw, to become more isolated, to look within the family and say, you know, well, we keep our problems to ourselves, you know, we don't reach out for help. You know, so there's sort of this restricted energy that happens. And as a consequence, good coping skills are not employed. For example, people don't necessarily reach out because they're ashamed or they're embarrassed, you know, to get the help, you know, to let anyone know that there's a problem.
Well, and that again has back to do with, imagine, origin in terms of if you don't know where this came from. Well, I mean, we do that even with grief in our culture.
Sure.
We act like it's catching, okay, even when that's so obviously not true, but we do that. So I can imagine with something like this, that would be even greater. How about guilt? I mean, this sense of a parent or child, I mean, is that sense that somehow I should have known or I should do something about this? Or?
Well, sometimes siblings and sometimes children believe that they could have prevented the illness from occurring, or maybe something they did or didn't do caused their sibling or their parent to become ill. If they had only acted a certain way, then maybe the parent wouldn't have become ill. So even some children even blame themselves for being born. Oh, if I were not born, then my parent wouldn't have become ill. And in addition to that, when you have a sibling who's mentally ill, there can be a tremendous amount of guilt, survivor's guilt in a way. You know, well, I'm well, my sibling's sick, you know, and a lot of behaviors get played out around that. You know, either they go into, you know, trying to achieve sort of much more than, or try to achieve some of the achievements that the sick sibling maybe set out to.
Sort of maybe make up
for it.
Yeah.
But there's kind of a bind there because they feel pressure, sort of an internal pressure, maybe external pressure too, to perform, you know, and some siblings and children feel like there's a pressure to be perfect, right? But at the same time, there's a tremendous amount of guilt that comes along with that, right? So they're caught, right?
Because I would guess because in reality there is no way for you to, in actuality, fill that void. You can't.
There isn't.
I mean,
right.
that person, particularly if they're still there.
Right.
You know, there they are. And I mean, that happens with I know, death of siblings as well. That's sort of, well, we need to fill that hole, and sort of the family needs to come to terms with the fact that nobody can do that.
Right. I think what happens is a lot of the coping skills, a lot of, you know, people searching for, well, what's the cure, you know, and you know, we should go into advocacy for mental illness. We should, you know, a lot of what siblings and children and parents do around the mental illnesses is they go in directions that actually prevent them from dealing directly with the grief, with the loss that's right before them. So instead of allowing themselves to accept the loss, or the losses, you know, then sometimes what they do is say, oh, okay, well, let's find out what the cause is, or let's go search for a cure, you know.
sure. Kind of allows you kind of to stay up in your head.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Now, in terms of lowered self-esteem, how does it affect the self-esteem of the siblings?
Well, some of the obvious things that happen can be, say, for example, you have a sibling that becomes mentally ill. Well, immediately the well siblings go into sort of adjusting around that. Okay, so what can happen is that normal developmental things that a well sibling would do, such as playing sports or going out on dates or, you know, being really active, some of those behaviors they would naturally do stop, right? So, and they do that in efforts to protect, you know, protect themselves from being humiliated or embarrassed, from someone finding out that they have, you know, a sibling with mental illness. They do that to protect their parents, right? So, so they go into sort of a, they retreat, right, and become isolated. Well, immediately that's going to affect self-esteem.
Yes, it does.
Right.
Because you're not playing out your own life at that point.
Right.
Okay. Yeah. And which ties to the interrupted normal development. And then in terms of recurrent patterns, before we take our break, I would gather that you're referring to the fact that we continue to play out those coping patterns in new relationships as well.
That's true. What happens is that we tend to get into relationships where either the person, either we're not able to talk about our thoughts and feelings with someone else, we become, we don't perceive people as being trustworthy, right? So people become not safe, right? So we get in patterns of being with other people where we might be with them, but we don't let them know who we are.
Okay.
Right.
And part of that, I would guess, is that internalized potential for flaw, or the paternalized, well, if they really got to know me, maybe they might find out I'm not as stable.
Or they might find out I have a sibling.
I might have a sibling.
Right, because that's the family secret, is that, you know, there's someone who's ill. But also what we see is that as far as recurring patterns, you may have someone who has a sibling who has a mental illness or a parent who has a mental illness, and then they get into relationships with other people who are not really emotionally stable, and they become rescuers, caretakers.
And continue that relationship. Let's take a quick break. Stay with us. When we return, we'll look at emotions and self-care and support. Stay with us.